Okay, everybody, welcome to paragraph 8. Welcome to paragraph 8 of our article, Cinderella the Legend by Madonna Kolbenschlag. This one is an interesting one because some people get a little confused with it. It almost seems like there's a shift in it. The second part of this paragraph kind of leads into what's going to be explained in the last paragraph. But let's just get back to what it says about this. It says in paragraph 8, and we'll start with the slipper. Everybody knows about the slipper in Cinderella. The version that we're most familiar with, she loses her slipper as she's rushing from the ball, the glass slipper. It stays glass even though everything magically changes. Some people say that that's showing the magical shift or something like that. How the magic is allowed, and I am gonna add a little part about the magic in a little bit. But the slipper, as the central icon in the story, it's something that is obviously used in a lot of different versions of this story. But here she lists it as a symbol of sexual bondage and imprisonment in a stereotype. Okay? Now, some people might say, well, you might be going a little overboard with this. It's just a slipper. But here, what she's really talking about, once again, is the concept of the foot and how important this is in history, because this is where a lot of folks lean on when they say they think that the story of Cinderella actually originated in an Asian country, specifically in China, okay? Because historically the virulence of its significance, the horror of it, is born out of the twisted horrors, or out in the twisted horrors of Chinese foot binding practices. Okay, if you're not familiar with that, I'm not going to tell you to look it up or anything like that. But the idea is, the concept of this comes from the fact that throughout history, not as much recently, obviously, but historically, there was a belief in Asian cultures, and some Asian cultures, particularly in China, where a woman would seem more desirable to be a wife, or more desirable in general, if they had smaller feet. The smaller, the better. Okay, and in order to make a girl more attractive to a higher society of person, including all the way up to princes, they would go through a practice of foot binding, which in essence means, and this gets pretty graphic, so I don't recommend you look it up, even though this practice continued into the 1920s, that I'm aware of. And in essence, what happened was the bones in all the bones in the feet were broken, almost in a ritualistic way, and then formed over each other, and you would see the toes all crossed up, and the arch would be pulled back in, and pushed in and everything like that, to try to make the foot seem as small as possible. And then it would be bound in leather straps and rebound, often, in order to make sure it stays that way and it grows together that way. So instead of having a foot out like this, it would be really tiny and all in, like, curled up and crossed, and it would be much smaller, okay? To the point of taking a 9-inch foot, 8 or 9-inch foot, and turning it into 3 inches, okay? So that's why they believe that this story may have originated in some fashion from that culture, just because, even in the stories versions that we see that are much more recent, they talk about how dainty her foot is. And you watch the Disney versions, and they have the stepsisters with the real long feet or big feet and that type of thing. And we're aware, a lot of you are aware that in the Grimm version, they discussed the stepsisters cutting off toes and that type of thing to fit. And I did mention in one of the classes that one version that I had read that I thought was also from Germany, but it might be mistaken. This person went into much more detail, more elaborate detail of the stepsister cutting off the sides of her feet too, because her foot was too wide, and the prince was down there saying, I can't tell if this fits or not, because the keeps filling with blood and all this stuff. I mean, it's a, you know, much more descriptive, gory detail of that, okay? And so it goes into another part, though, that the slipper itself is a symbol of power, all right? Because the moment the prince put the slipper on, and, you know, they immediately became a couple, and when they got married, she obviously became a princess, which moved her up the social status, you know, and as we talked about with the Marxist critical perspective, that you know, the higher you are in a social status in society, oftentimes equals more power, okay? So technically, it says with all of its accompanying restrictions and demands for conformity, all right, we're going to get to that in a second, but when the prince offers her the lost slipper, we'll talk about this too, the gift of the magic bird, he makes his kingdom hers. So in essence, she does gain more power, all right, but go back to what it says about restrictions and demands for conformity. All right, she still has to conform. She still has to be the woman in the relationship and the female, and she's never going to have the level as the male in this society. Okay, he found her, he kind of purchased her, and now she is his. Okay, and then this gift of the magic bird, the part that, you know, the people are curious about. There have been versions of this, like I mentioned in a couple of classes, that one version of the Cinderella tale where this may have come from, there was a Middle Eastern version where there was a ruler, a king, a pharaoh, however you want to describe him, who was sitting on a throne that was outside watching his servants working on, you know, around the area in front of him. And meanwhile, across his kingdom, there was a woman who was hanging clothes on a clothesline, and she had taken her slippers off, or her sandals off, okay? And a bird swooped down, grabbed the sandal, and flew off, and dropped it into this ruler's lap. And he sat there looking at it, and as soon as he looked at it, he fell in love with the woman and said, I must find this woman wherever she may be and find the one who fits this slipper, okay, or this sandal. I keep saying slipper because of the tale we're familiar with, okay, that fits this sandal. And sure enough, he went out, he eventually found her, and she became, you know, his queen or his bride, okay? That just is another version, and obviously we can poke a lot of holes in that one as well, all right? So in essence, this whole thing is discussing the concept of the slipper and how it's a representation of both conformity, you know, both like a symbol of horror, you know, some would say in this, but also of power, okay? This icon holds many different avenues, okay?